But the thing to know is if you are the boss of just, 5 people or 5,000 people, if you are the boss, you put people in a threat state before you say a word. So you're putting people in a threat state, a status threat and a certainty threat and an autonomy threat. And probably a relatedness threat because you have competing goals. And maybe a fairness threat because you paid more money for seemingly less work. So you're putting people in at least 1, if not 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 threat states before you say a word.
Can you achieve extraordinary results while making the world a better place? I'm Bruce Temkin, and together we'll explore how. Welcome to Humanity at Scale, Redefining Leadership podcast. Join me as I speak with visionary leaders and top experts to uncover the secrets of humanity-centric leadership. Ready to rethink leadership? Let's dive in. Hello, and welcome back to Humanity at Scale. Leaders today are facing pressures unlike anything we've seen before. Constant change, rising complexity, and a workplace where people's emotional and cognitive capacity is stretched thin. And underneath it all is something we don't talk about nearly enough. The simple fact that every leadership challenge at its core is a human brain challenge. My guest today, David Rock, has spent almost 2 decades showing leaders what happens when we stop guessing about human behavior and start grounding leadership in actual science. He coined the term NeuroLeadership, founded the NeuroLeadership Institute, and helped bring ideas like growth mindset, psychological safety, and brain-friendly behavior change into some of the world's largest organizations. What I love about David's work is that it reframes leadership in a very human way. Instead of asking, how do we get people to perform? He asks, what does the brain need in order to think clearly, feel safe, and do its best work? That shift changes everything. How we motivate, how we design culture, how we lead through uncertainty, and how we build workplaces that feel truly human. David, thank you for joining me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks for having me. It's a kind of interesting irony that we're studying something very scientific to actually make organizations better for humans. But that's inevitably what happens when you look through the brain lens. You realize how important our fundamental biological humanity is. So look forward to this conversation.
Well, more on that. I want to get to talking about you in a second, but I want to jump on the moment because I think that's a great point, right? Which is that throughout my career, I've always tried to jump into areas that people thought were soft and squishy and apply models and data to try and make them real. And it turns out like the stuff that you're doing is like that, right? People would think about, how people think, how they feel, that's squishy. We need to do some hard work around hard things. So what motivated you to step in and apply science where everyone else was probably just saying, that's just some, things off the side and soft, squishy stuff? How did you start thinking about the science?
It was kind of a happy accident in a way. So I'd been studying brain research independently as a personal interest for a very long time. Like I started reading pretty obsessively about the brain in my mid-teens, and then started to really dive in and follow the research. But I didn't study it academically till much, much later in my 40s. But I was just personally obsessed with understanding the brain. And it came through the lens of being a mindfulness practitioner really early, an observer of attention, and all of that. And so I was just very curious about sort of the workings of our attention and our insights and our ability to manage emotions, all this stuff. So long time, like literally, 40 plus years thinking about that. And cut a long story short, I kind of accidentally started including some of this brain research in some programs that I'd already built. And I saw the difference in, not so much in attendance or marketing, but in the impact of ideas. And it was just like, people just made sense of things so much easier. Whether it was trust or insight itself or, connecting with others, or whatever it was, like everything just made much more sense. And I kind of accidentally started a field because I gathered all these scientists I'd been studying with and got them together with business leaders. And it just became clear that there was a lot of value in this space. And I just sort of followed the energy, started a journal, started, an institute, and, published now over 60 papers on this topic. But it's been a case of following the energy, and there's just a lot of value and energy in looking at leadership challenges from a brain perspective. And one is it makes it more concrete, which is just easier to process from a brain perspective. Another thing is you have a common language now for all leadership questions. So you don't need to go to like 25 different thought leaders and 25,000 different models. Like if you're looking at why is feedback hard, you can look at the brain. If you're looking at how do you motivate a team, you're actually looking at the brain from a tiny different angle, but actually the same things. If you're looking at why do I need to repeat myself over and over as a leader, you're looking at the brain from another perspective. If you're looking at why is everyone so overwhelmed? So whatever the leadership question, you actually come back to a consistent and coherent body of research that enables you to basically get smarter and smarter about both leading and humans, right? As opposed to more and more overwhelmed every new thought leader you speak to. So we just found that it was this one consistent language that could make people better leaders and smarter leaders because they're understanding people better rather than more and more models. That's the summary.
Cool. So for our listeners, the institute and the area that you created was something called NeuroLeadership. And so maybe for our audience, talk about what is, I think we conceptually get NeuroLeadership, but for, the novices out there, what is NeuroLeadership?
Yeah, sure. So, I coined the term in about 2007. We ran the first NeuroLeadership Summit that year. 2008, we ran a NeuroLeadership Summit in New York and Sydney and started a journal, started a master's degree and all this. And, so we've been forming the field in the last 20 or so years. And there's a few other people that are now stepping into it, but we're like 50 papers ahead of anyone that's thinking about it. But it's basically the study of everything to do with people in organizations from a brain perspective. So it's not just sort of senior leadership decision making or something. It's the whole sort of human side of business from a brain perspective. So it's how do you hire better? It's how do you organize teams better? It's how do you motivate better? It's how do you do rewards and recognition better? How do you do feedback better? How do you drive change better? How do you deliver learning better? So we study all, everything that might be sort of in the HR and talent function we look at. But the implications of this work is super relevant to finance and marketing and operations and, sales. So we end up, teaching people in all functions basically how to be more effective. Now, generally we work with a manager population from frontline manager all the way up. And what we're doing is, we're not trying to see if they'll be a good leader or not by testing their brain. We're not scanning them, right? We're giving them more accurate language for people things that helps them in real time see what's going on, right? If you imagine we had no financial language, no profit and loss, no cash flow, none of that, right? And then someone said, hey, I've got this system that'll help you notice patterns over time in complex, structures so you can improve them, right? It'd be like this whole world would open up. Now, a profit and loss is not a business, but it's an important, set of insights. And a really similar way, when you suddenly have this language for what the brain is doing, you have this other set of insights that helps you make really different decisions. And it's just a very, very useful language. So we've taught different aspects of that language. We worked it out to about, approximately 20 million managers and leaders in the last decade. Give you a sense of it. So there's quite a bit of scale happening, but now we're on track to see if we can get to more like that every year, which we'll see how we go with that. But it's building a language for leadership that's all based on the brain. That's just to do with everything to do with people management.
So before we get into the detail on some of this, I'd love I think listeners would probably want to hear, what is some of the language? What's an example of the language that you're giving leaders, and how would they apply that language?
There's sort of three of the biggest challenges of leadership basically are limited cognitive capacity is one. So just how hard it is to think about new things, how much we have to think about, how hard it is to make decisions. So limited cognitive capacity, right, is so there's a whole bunch of language in there. The second one is the challenges of self-regulation, which is managing our emotions. And those two are in a seesaw, by the way. So the stronger your emotions, the worse your cognitive capacity. But also the more mistakes you make and the more you upset other people and all sorts of other bad things. So those are two buckets, right? Limited capacity, poor self-regulation. And the third one is the challenges of what's called social cognition, which is just understanding other people, what motivates them, what their goals are. So understanding, motivating, and developing other people accurately and effectively when our brain just assumes everyone's just like us. So we've created a lot of different models. Probably the most powerful, sticky, and helpful one has been what we call the SCARF model, which has huge relevance for the second and third challenge, but also it helps you with the first one. SCARF is basically describing what your brain does when you interact with another human in any way. So it's really it's really the neuroscience of social interactions, but it's also a very accurate neuroscience of inclusion, of psychological safety, of belonging, of motivation, of engagement, and all the other things that involve kind of stuff between people. So conflict, collaboration, teaming, like all of those things are understood better through SCARF. In fact, when we've looked at whole leadership curriculums, generally SCARF is a very helpful framework in about 2/3 of every hour people would spend learning anything. And so it can replace a lot of, like, you can put in SCARF and throw out 25 models and everything fits together better. So anyway, it stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness, right? Status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness. And each one of these, the brain is tracking all of them, right? But what it's tracking, first of all, with each one of these is there a danger or threat in this that I need to avoid? And is there an opportunity or reward I need to have more of, right? So we're staying away from, say, status threats, right? Someone who insults us or someone who's mean to us or someone who puts us down. We're avoiding those. We're moving towards status rewards, status opportunities, chances to look good, chances to look smart, all of this. And that basic mechanism drives swathes of human behavior, but also swathes of the economy, right? The watch, the car, the outfits, the being funnier. If you can't be tall, you're going to be funny. If you can't be funny, you're going to be intelligent. If you can't be, we find a way to not have low status, because low status is literally pain in the brain, right? So status, plays out, but all of these play out in like minimize threat, maximize reward. And what you'll see is that in particularly leadership, like the act of driving change creates status threats, certainty threats, autonomy threats, fairness threats, And so what we're trying to do is minimize those threats in the way we lead. We're trying to minimize those threats and maximize those rewards, and many, many ways of doing that. But it just provides a language to ideally ahead of time minimize the negative reactions of anything and maximize the positive reactions of everything, right? So you're trying to minimize the negative reactions of anything, maximize the positive reactions of everything according to those domains. And just gives you a much more granular understanding of what's going on in the human brain as you interact and drive change over time.
I love it because leaders who care, who want to make sure that they're doing the right things and driving the organization the right way, now have, like, instead of a fuzzy view of the world, they have 5 things they can check off and think about. They can think about status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And you brought it up in the context of, I think, one of your core ideas, which is the idea about the difference between threat and safety, right? That it's a core. What are some of the most common ways that leaders unknowingly trigger threat responses in people's brains? Because I'm sure that the leaders aren't going around going, I want to do this. So a lot of the results are unwittingly based on behaviors. What are some of those?
Yeah, very unconscious. Firstly, let me just say that threat versus reward is, or threat versus safety, however you want to look at it, is the organizing principle of the brain at all levels of scale that we know. So this like do more, do less is, all the way down to neurons that fire together, wire together, right? It's neurons that are basically doing more or doing less. Toward and away is more and less, and all the way up through all the scales of how the brain functions. To individual behavior, group behavior, organizational behavior, country behavior, planetary behavior. Like it's the organizing principle of human behavior, right? We're always in one of those two states. And so it's a very, very, very central thing. Now, I was working, I met this leader a few years ago. It was a while ago now, probably more than a decade. She read the piece that I wrote on Scarf that became sort of the most popular piece on it. I wrote a piece called Managing with the Brain in Mind. It's still available out there for Strategy and Business magazine, Managing with the Brain in Mind. And it was sort of the big piece introducing Scarf, the mainstream. And she read this article and she wrote to me and said, can you come and see me? I want to understand. I'm having this real problem. And she turned out to be the CEO of a major company. I won't mention who it is without her permission, but she sat down and said to me, "Look, I've had this horrible realization that I might be accidentally like making my team less intelligent the way I'm managing them." And I'm like, "Well, walk me through what you do." And like, she'd describe a meeting where she'd get her top 10 people together. They'd come to a meeting, they'd each present their ideas, and she'd tell them why they're wrong. And challenge their ideas publicly and attack their ideas. And she just couldn't get people to speak up. People weren't seem to. And she's like, "I read your piece on status. Am I missing something here?" And I'm like, "Yeah, what you're doing is creating a pain response, very similar to physical pain. And just like you can't, think well when you've stubbed your toe for the first 2 minutes, like they can't think well while they're protecting themselves." And she looked at it and she processed it. She went, "Wow, I'm going to change my complete leadership style." And to her credit, she did. And she literally went on the next year to be the most value generating CEO of that year from the Fortune 500. Completely changed her leadership style. And she said, I now create a towards state. I'm working on creating a towards state with my people, not a threat state. And it was, she went on to speak at our conference quite a few times and tell the story. But it was just basically this insight that going at people, attacking their ideas, like the ex-Microsoft CEO used to do that. He's renowned, right? Bill Gates, for coming in and just attacking people's ideas. It's very tempting, especially if you are the smartest person in the room. And a lot of leaders are often, but not always, the smartest person in the room. And those ones often, have challenges with creating status threats in others. But the thing to know is if you are the boss of just, 5 people or 5,000 people, if you are the boss, you put people in a threat state before you say a word. So you're putting people in a threat state, a status threat and a certainty threat and an autonomy threat, and probably a relatedness threat because you have competing goals, and maybe a fairness threat because you paid more money for seemingly less work, right? So you're putting people in at least 1, if not 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 threat states, right? Before you say a word, right? So what I say is it's like you're trying to cross a river. The river's going fast to the left towards threat. You're trying to get across to the other side. You're going to have to swim hard upstream because there's just this constant sense of threat people are feeling. So you're going to have to send a lot of positive scarf signals. You're going to have to send you get to do a lot of work to just not create more threat, right? If you just say, "How's that project going?" people are going to get threatened. If you say, "We need to talk," people are definitely threatened. If you say, "I'm not sure I love how you did that," people are threatened. So people are already in this primed for threat state as a leader. Even if you say nothing at all and you come in, before that moment, they're already in that threat state. So, but then of course you can do terrible things like just attack people's ideas publicly. But I think you get the point.
I think to some degree, you'd expect leaders to know that if they attack the people, the blatant stuff, right? If they attack people, that's going to shut them down. Right, you'd expect they'd have the EQ to figure that out. I love it. I love it. For those of you just listening, David's shaking his head like, "Oh my God, you don't know how many leaders probably don't even have that."
You'd
right?
expect they would, but not all, for sure. A lot of very successful leaders don't care. A lot of super goal-focused people are renowned for not caring and delivering incredible results in their business. And that's like a complicated outlier. It's like, Steve Jobs was known for coming in and yelling people, and because he had this goal focus that was much more important than his people focus, right? The two are often in opposition. They're actually in opposition in the brain, right? So a lot of very high performing leaders are known for just upsetting a lot of people, but for them, the goal is more important than people's feelings. And they just kind of cut to it. And they often, go too far and cause all sorts of unnecessary problems. But even lower than that, you do have a lot of very high performing leaders in all sorts of industries that are still accidentally creating very unnecessary threats.
I want to do a couple angles on this. One angle is, and following up on Steve Jobs, right? A leader to some degree is who they are. A person is to some degree who they are, right? Can a leader like Steve Jobs, and he did this, right? Not change his behavior that much, but surround himself by people who fill in the gap for those elements that they're poor at, right? Like I know I'm going to come in and create this sort of threat state in everyone, but I have leaders around who come in afterwards who soften it up and handle all the problems and solve all the
It's called
issues.
HR. Yeah, it's called HR. They come in and try to clean up the mess
Well,
afterwards.
hopefully it's not HR. Like HR is one model. The other model is I have two executive vice presidents who handle operations. I come in, shake it up, and then they settle it down and works with the teams, not in an HR mode, but in an operational mode.
It's important that a leader does that, but the shake it up should be about like showing different futures and challenging people. And they should be shaking things up. They should leave people feeling like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do here. And then the other people come in and we lay out the plan, right? So the leader has the vision, and maybe other senior leader, maybe other executives come in with the plan and they're like, okay, I know you're all uncomfortable. Let's think this through. Let's work this out. That's super healthy. That's very adaptive, right? And what's not adaptive is a leader creating unnecessary conflict. And I'm not saying Steve Jobs did that necessarily. I wasn't there, so I can only speak very, very secondhand. But a lot of leaders are doing incredible things, and maybe as a CEO they can get away with that. What's interesting in companies is increasingly companies are saying, look, we need the what and the how of results. We're not just measuring performance on did they close $1 million deal. If they upset, half their team and they all quit as a result, then that's not okay. So a lot of companies, when they, manage performance, think about promotions, and increasingly so, they're looking at the what and the how. So we're helping a, major company right now think about a new how, so that they can actually measure people, really thoroughly on their skills. So generally, with the exception of these outliers, these sort of problematic outliers who have these huge missions and huge passion projects, it doesn't tend to work down the organization very well. Sometimes it can work at the very top of a very big organization with some side effects, but it can be very adaptive in that sense, but it doesn't tend to work down in the organization.
Okay, so the flip side of that, that question with Steve Jobs is sort of like, what happens if you don't change the leader? The second part of that, let's say we want to change the leader and you're helping organizations change how leaders behave. What practices help leaders regulate their own brain, managing emotion, attention, and reactivity so they can stay grounded and empathetic? If that's a model you want under pressure. How do you teach that? What are the practices?
Yeah, for sure. So, look, we think in terms of habit activation at scale. So, we're helping 2 or 3 million leaders a year develop new habits. And there's lots of different habits they're developing, but there are 3 really common themes that we do a lot of work on. One is growth mindset. The second one is psychological safety, which is actually healthy debate, not just people feeling safe, right? And the third is accountability. Right. So growth mindset, psychological safety, accountability. So what we do is we look at the 3 most important habits in each one of those, and we teach them to an individual over time. So any individual leader is going to learn that, one of those things in a month. They're not going to a class for one off. They're not watching a video. They're learning it over a month, and they're probably learning it with their peers or with their team over a month, a little bit every week. So that's our learning model. Right, our learning model scales brilliantly, scales much better than workshops, not just cost, like actual habit activation. So we measure habits. So we'll take something like growth mindset. We know the 3 habits that are really central to that. We'll teach those one at a time, lots of different ways. It might be Zoom sessions. It might be sending videos with conversation guides and structuring people to have conversations around the videos. We've now got an incredible AI tool. We've put everything that we've studied and learned and built into an AI. So this AI can actually teach you the content of growth mindset. Week 1, what's the first habit? Teach you the content, discuss where you might use it, get you actually using it and listen to you running a meeting. And at the end of that, give you feedback on how well you worked on, this habit of growth mindset, get you practicing again, right? Give you more feedback. So you can now use this AI as a real-time coach to both understand content, new habits, and practice things, get real-time feedback, all of this. So that's a new way. But generally what we do is we break any idea into 3 habits and deliver it over a month in a social construct. So it's not just you. And we find that scales. And 4 out of 5 people we do that with have sustained long-term habits across, huge numbers of people. So it's very, very effective, much more effective than training.
If you're enjoying this episode, make sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss a conversation. We've got plenty more great stories coming your way. So, are there the same 3 habits for everyone across growth mindset, psychological safety, and accountability, or are the 3 different for any set of leaders you're dealing with?
They're pretty consistent habits, right? So growth might, let's say psych safety, right? Set the stage, invite participation, respond thoughtfully are the 3 habits. Now, how you'll set the stage will be different as a first-time manager and a CEO. How you invite participation will be different, right? As a senior sales executive versus a technology leader, right? How you respond thoughtfully will be different if you're in HR versus you're a first-time employee. So the actual action you'll take will be variable, and we help people come up with their own actions. But generally, we find, and it takes us anywhere from 1 to 4.5 years to find these habits. But generally, we've been able to find 3 central habits that if you built those habits, you're like 90% there to having that capability, right? So, for example, growth mindset: experiment, value progress, learn from others. If you actually significantly increase how much you experiment, how much you really work on progress, on outcomes, and how much you really learn from others, if you do that, you have much more of a growth mindset. And so gone are the days of these checklists of 20 things you should do and, long complex things. We're like, look, do these 3 things. Do this one this week, practice it, talk to your peers about it. Next week, come back, do this one, etc. So we find that the habits are pretty consistent across industries, across countries, across levels of manager. And that's a beautiful thing. Now you can have a whole company all learn how to have more of a growth mindset all at the same time, which is the most powerful way of culture change, by the way. When you get a whole company working on something for a month or a quarter, you get major, major change. Because the number one reason people do something is they think everyone's doing it. And this is how we work. We'll try to get a whole company working on something for a month or a quarter, whatever size company, and then the next month or quarter, the next thing, etc. So that model of change at a company level is really powerful, but at an individual level, it's just one thing, a week for a month with peers, and quite a bit of science explained along the way to understand the why.
So let's say we're a senior leader and we want to get going. What's the typical first habit, the first area of the 3 and the first habit in those 3 that you like to start with?
Well, we found, so look, about half our work is custom leadership solutions. So like we built Microsoft's leadership model, which is create clarity, generate energy, deliver success, right? So we've done about 40 of those. We've done Microsoft, MasterCard, Colgate, many others. But so we'll define that model, and then we'll build an experience that people go through that model over a month or a quarter. And we'll build custom content. But off the shelf, about half our work is off the shelf. Off the shelf, we know there are about 16 habit sets that you could go through. There's about sort of 8 that are most common, and then another 8 that are sort of, more focused, more specialist. And of those 8 that are more common, we know that growth mindset is the best place to start. Because growth mindset is about opening your mind to learning more, to adapting more. In this digital age, in this AI age, growth mindset's more and more and more important all the time. So we'll often start with growth mindset, but even in a custom solution like with Microsoft, people will learn growth mindset as one of the first things. It's so foundational, helpful to start with. So we'll tend to start with that. Psychological safety or inclusion, or one of those human-focused things is a good next step to really understand people, learn the SCARF model, kind of get in there, and then maybe accountability. So we do a lot of what we call GPA, which is growth mindset, psych safety, accountability, kind of in that order, and do that over like maybe 3 months or over a year, and kind of embed that. So GPA is a pretty common strategy if we're not doing something custom.
So I want to talk a little bit about a different model. We have the SEEDS model, which is similarity, experience, expedience, distance, and safety, which I think did my homework, which is a good way to think about, a framework for forms of bias in the brain, right? So when you think about that, why do you think traditional bias training fails, right? Like, the world is full of bias and we haven't gotten rid of it. And how does the brain approach change the way organizations should and do address bias?
Yeah, I mean, bias is such an inbuilt part of our brain, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. You need bias to, make it to breakfast. You just there's so many decisions in that first half hour. If you were having to make each one of them fresh, you just wouldn't make it, right? So it's bias is also approximation and assumptions and generalizations and categorizations and all that. And it's sort of bias is an extrapolation of that, So, but there are negative biases that just unfortunately help us make maladaptive decisions, maladaptive business decisions, how much we invest, what we invest, how long we schedule things, and maladaptive people decisions, who we hire and how we structure. So there are definitely decisions that are accidentally biased in the workplace. The trouble is, it's not like you can't actually detect enough of your own biases, no matter how much you know about them and no matter how much you care. Just like you can't see yourself the way other people see you, you also can't add up, 3 digits in your head and multiply 3 digits in your head at the same time. Like you need a break of a few seconds at least between one cognitive task, another cognitive task. And so the challenge with bias is that while you're doing a cognitive task, you can't do the second cognitive task of, am I being biased? So it's actually a cognitive constraint that individuals can't see bias in their thinking process while they're actually thinking. Sometimes after the fact, you look back and you go, that was silly. But, that was bias. I, didn't recognize this. So you can't do much about biasing yourself. And so any strategy that basically says, let's raise everyone's awareness about bias, just makes everyone see everyone else's bias. Because you can see other people's bias. And the other problem that we found is that there was 100 plus or minus biases. And there was no strategy for mitigating them except one that only works very small percentage of the time, which was, try harder. So what we did, this was the 4.5-year project. It took us 4.5 years to build Seeds, and a false start, publishing, retracting, all this stuff. So we found that we could organize the biases into 5 brain categories based on how the brain creates it. And this becomes a sticky framework, not for catching your own biases, but for calling each other out in a friendly way, right? So as a team is making a decision, we can't hire that person, they're too different. Someone's going to stand up and say, hang on, that sounds like a safety bias. Let's follow this strategy that works for a safety bias. But if it's a similarity bias, you follow a different strategy. If it's an expedience bias, it's like medicine. Someone says they're not feeling well, you don't just give them antibiotics, right? They might need a glass of water. They might need a nap. They might need to be amputated, a leg amputated. You don't know, right? You got to find out what's really going on. With bias, they're driven by very different brain processes. So you want to know what category of bias is happening here, and then you know how to address it. So that's how we came to Seeds. And so it's gone to millions and millions of people. Seeds has been taught to millions of people and, intelligence agencies in multiple countries and all sorts of, government authorities. And it's not so much about, racism or sexism or any of that at all. In fact, it's not about that at all. It's just about brains have this quirk of assuming and generalizing, and that's usually helpful. But for bigger decisions, it can be harmful. And so we teach people not to question everything, but for bigger decisions like big investments, big hires, big processes, like make sure you're not being accidentally biased. And at a senior level, that's every day, right? They're making big decisions every day. At a mid-level, it's like a couple of times a week. At a junior level, it's a couple of times a month. So it's a framework, depending where you are, that becomes really useful at different scales to make sure you're not maladaptively generalizing as opposed to adaptively generalizing.
In a lot of these situations, I think of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is sort of recognize what you're doing, name it, and then have some strategy around dealing with it. Is that a simplistic way to think about a lot of the interventions you do as an individual on sort of either eliminating bias or adopting the SCARF habits in a new way?
Well, the interesting thing about bias is that doesn't work at all with bias. You actually can't recognize your own biases. So people think they can, but they miss like huge swathes of them. So it's definitely a technique for something like growth mindset. I know the CBT world well, like labeling something, making a different decision, executing that decision. Like that's absolutely a foundational mechanism behind something like growth mindset, something like SCARF. Also, just the sort of language we built around limited capacity, other things around having insights, like that sort of recognize things, label things, make different choices. Super foundational. It just completely falls apart with bias because it's not just motivated cognition or lack of self-awareness or lack of caring. You just don't see them, which is not that surprising because the network in the brain for detecting information freshly is like a cubic foot to the Milky Way. That's your unconscious, right? So you got a cubic foot of self-awareness and an unconscious that's the Milky Way size. So there's a lot that you miss. And even if you double or triple or quadruple the size of your, cubic foot, so a lot more, you're still missing a lot of the Milky Way. So it just doesn't work with bias. With bias, you need support. You need other people supporting each other to detect biases and to also take it out of processes, right? So not to try to take it out of ourselves, but to try to take it out of the team together, or try to take it out of processes. So that's been a different pathway. Don't take it out of yourself. Take it out of the team process and take it out of processes themselves.
I love that. I love that look, not out of yourself, but as a group and processes. So I'm gonna do a little shift and have you think about the future. So we're entering a new era defined by AI, distributed work, cognitive overloads, and shifting social norms. Everything's changing around us. Leaders need new tools and deeper humanity to navigate what's ahead. As you look ahead, what big ideas or scientific insights do you believe will define the next phase of leadership?
Yeah, there's a lot to say about that. Firstly, I just hope this era is not being not 25 years old and being in my 50s. I can remember everyone being very, very excited about the .com era first coming out, and pets.com and cars.com and all that. And there was this huge fortune created and this huge fortune lost in that period of time around the year 2000 and the whole fear of that, all this. So I just hope we're not doing that again. There's been some whispers around that the AI thing's a giant circular economy so we'll see. I mean, the challenge, I think it's going to make a lot of things, AI will make a lot of things easier. And we've written about this a lot lately, that to use AI well, you actually have to think deeply. And people are trying to use AI to not think deeply. So it's a bit of a challenge. And to be good at AI, you need to be good at what's called metacognition, which is thinking about thinking. That's what you got to think deeply about. You got to think deeply about thinking itself. And we've been looking at that and the skills involved, the habits, right? It's humility, flexibility, vigilance, right? So you got to be really good at being mentally humble and flexible and vigilant. Fortunately, these are learnable skills, but I think, leaders need to be really, really good at getting people AI fluent, but that involves being really clever about thinking and those habits. So it's just an interesting time. I think the role of understanding the brain is increasing, it's going to become increasingly important to understand the brain and recognize biases, recognize threats, recognize, capacity limitations, recognize when you need to stop being linear and let a breakthrough come through. So, just an interesting time for that. The irony is that leaders are going to have to understand people better. They're going to see them less, interact with them less. So it's becoming harder and more important to understand, motivate, and develop. So harder and more important, right? To understand, motivate, and develop. So I think the need to understand people quickly will increase, and there's not necessarily an AI solution for all of that. It can help with parts of it.
Awesome. All right. So this is a good point to transition into my closing questions, the same set of questions I ask all of our guests. The first one is, what one leadership skill do you think will become even more important in the future?
Metacognition. Thinking about thinking. It's definitely big. That's a big one. And I think that's essential for AI use. It's central for leadership. It's central for all of us. So just this capacity to think about thinking is just going to accelerate and increase. And maybe a sister capacity is just this ability to deal with change. Change has never been this fast, but it's never going to be this slow again. We're going to look back lovingly on 2025, like we look back lovingly on 2015 and how lovely the pace was back there, right? So we're at the very early stages of AI integration. We haven't even seen robotic integration or quantum integration. Like you put quantum-driven, AI-driven robots in every home, powered by satellite, massively fast internet. Entire industries are going to be remade, entire industries. And I think what you'll see in 20 years from now is many of the companies that you see now are just gone. Many of them completely, changed. So I think the change is not slowing down. Change is going to accelerate a lot. So I would say metacognition and the ability to lead through change are the big ones.
Now, if you could wave a magic wand and instantly make organizations more humanity-centric, what would you change first?
I just teach everyone about the brain. It works. We have CHROs who bring us into an organization, teach everyone about SCARF and all this. They get a new job. They call us like before they even start the job. They say, well, we need you in this company. We need you to start straight away. We need everyone to understand this language. So it's just such a helpful tool to understand the brain. And especially given that, look, the world is run by 1,000 companies and 1,000 people inside those companies. It's 1 million leaders. The world is run by 1 million leaders, the top 1,000 in the top 1,000 companies. Almost to a T, those people are academically trained. Engineers, doctors, MBAs, accountants, lawyers. That's it, right? So like they've just described like 95+% of people. They're all academically trained, and it's one of those 5 categories, right? So now you're at 1 million people. You want to influence 1 million people who are all academically trained. You want to use something that's as concrete and evidence-based and verifiable as you can. And it turns out that looking at people issues from a brain perspective is currently the most concrete evidence-based thing you can do. So we think it's a really viable and valuable way forward.
Okay, what's one final piece of advice you'd like to leave with our listeners?
Pay attention to your attention. Your attention is your limited resource. Pay attention to your attention. Look at when your attention is best. Experiment with different ways of working. But pay attention to attention, I think, is the big thing. And pay attention to other people's attention. Going back to Steve Jobs, he was a student of attention. He built these incredible products because he watched how people watch, right? He watched how people processed, and he watched how he processed. And a lot of that came from all sorts of different experiences, Eastern worlds and psychedelics, all sorts of different things. But he was a student of how people observe, and he was an observer of observing. And I think as a manager, leader, individual contributor, entrepreneur, all the opportunities come from just observing the world around you, seeing where the bottlenecks are, and solving them. That's where value is created overall.
Awesome. And finally, where can people follow your work and go deeper into the ideas you've discussed?
Lots of opportunities. We have a huge podcast since 2020. We record every week. It's called Your Brain at Work. You'll find it on Spotify and iTunes everywhere. So, 500 something episodes. Don't start at the beginning. But that's a great resource. My book, Your Brain at Work, same title. My book, Your Brain at Work, is the story of how everything works. We have this AI we built, which is blowing us away. I could have had him listening to this interview and giving us both feedback on the interview. Mind-blowing. But ask Niles. So Niles, Niles, Neuro Intelligent Leadership Enhancing System. AskNiles.ai. You can go in and learn about Niles in there and get access there. Otherwise, NeuroLeadership, so Neuro, NeuroLeadership.com, gives you access to a whole world of corporate solutions. And there are also some individual programs for individuals to learn about the brain and learn about brain-based coaching and that kind of thing. So lots of different access there.
Maybe I'll have Niles join me on a future podcast here.
Yeah, no, he's amazing for presentations. He spots exactly what you did well and why from a brain perspective, and what you might do differently next time, and explain that from a brain perspective. And he's quite remarkable. I'll send you a free code. You can have a play and start to see what's possible there.
I love it. Well, David, thank you for joining me. This has been fascinating.
Thanks so much, Bruce. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with David Rock as much as I did. Now join me in the after show, where I'll reflect on our conversation and share some of the insights that I found most memorable. Welcome to the after show. That was a remarkable conversation. David Rock brings decades of neuroscience and leadership research to the table, and it showed. He made something I talk about often feel even more concrete. Most of what we think of as leadership problems are really brain problems. Hearing him connect the dots was incredibly powerful. Let me walk through 5 quick takeaways that really stood out. The first is that leadership makes more sense when you see it through the brain. David didn't start by trying to invent a new leadership model. He started as a curious student of the brain who noticed that when he brought neuroscience into his programs, people suddenly understood things like trust and motivation more clearly. Instead of chasing endless leadership fads, he's giving leaders one coherent language based on how attention, emotion, and social connection actually work. The second takeaway is that threat versus reward sits underneath almost every leadership moment. I loved his story about the CEO who realized she was accidentally making her team less intelligent. By publicly challenging people's ideas, she was triggering status threats that show up in the brain like physical pain. David's point was simple and sobering. As a leader, you put people into multiple threat states, areas like status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness, what they call SCARF. Those pains exist before you even say a word. Good leadership is often about removing unnecessary threat so people can actually think. The third takeaway is that simple habits beat big competency lists. When David described how they help millions of leaders build new habits, it was striking how uncomplicated it is. For things like growth mindset, psychological safety, and accountability, they identified 3 core habits and help people practice one at a time over a month, usually with peers. The focus isn't on more workshops or more slides. It's on measurable habits that actually show up in meetings and day-to-day behaviors. The fourth takeaway is that bias isn't something you try harder to fix on your own. On bias, David was very clear. You cannot reliably catch your own biases while you're thinking. The brain just doesn't work that way. That's why his SEEDS model, similarity, experience, expedience, distance, and safety, is designed as a shared language for teams and processes, not as a mirror for heroic individuals. The goal is to build guardrails into big decisions so they're less distorted by hidden assumptions instead of pretending we can white-knuckle our way into being unbiased. The final takeaway is that the next era of leadership requires thinking about thinking. Looking ahead, David highlighted metacognition as a core leadership skill, especially in an AI-driven world. AI can do a lot, but it can't replace the human ability to step back, notice how we're thinking, see our limits, and sense when people are overloaded or threatened. His closing advice captured it nicely. Pay attention to your attention. Where you place it and how you protect it is becoming one of the most important leadership choices you make. So I'll leave you with one question to sit with after this episode. Where in your leadership are you still trying to fix people when you should be redesigning the environment so their brains can actually do their best work? That's it for now. I hope you enjoyed the episode. And remember, you are the flame that can spark humanity at scale. One decision, one conversation, one moment at a time. Thanks for tuning in to Humanity at Scale, Redefining Leadership podcast. Remember, true leadership isn't only about achieving short-term results. It's about creating a lasting, positive impact on all of the people you touch. Join me next time as we uncover more insights and strategies for humanity-centric leadership. Until then, I'm Bruce Temkin, encouraging you to lead with purpose and empathy and to be the spark that elevates humanity at scale.